Hey everyone, I'm Nick Raboy from MongoDB, and in this tutorial we're going to see how to move content out of MongoDB and onto the local file system. And I'm going to tell you a story on why this is important for my particular use case. So in developer relations at MongoDB, I needed to move some content, part of our blog, out of MongoDB so that way it could be published on a third-party platform. So as a result, I needed to figure out how to take all the Markdown that we had that needed to be moved and all of the media assets that might include pictures, video, etc. So that way I can upload it to an external platform. Now your use case might be different than mine, and it probably will be. And there are, sure enough, plenty of other ways to accomplish this particular task. But this is the script that I wrote, and I'll be walking through in this particular tutorial that helped me get the job done pretty easily. So for this particular example, I am using MongoDB Atlas. That's where all of my blog content, or otherwise CMS, content management system content, is stored. This is going to be a Node.js project. I'm not going to be using any kind of special frameworks. It's just going to be vanilla Node with the Node.js driver for MongoDB. And we're going to see some cool tips and tricks throughout the way. So up on my screen, this is just a very basic Node.js project. I've got the package.json file. I've got a main.js file, which is going to contain all of our code. Export list is going to be the content that I want to export out of MongoDB. So again, in my particular example, I am using a content management system. It stores a lot of our blog tutorials that we have at MongoDB. Here are some URL slugs, and I'm going to refer to them as slugs. These are the path after the domain. So you'd say something like www.mongodb.com/products, blah, blah, blah. That's what I'm talking about here. This is the slug that appears after the .com. So in this particular example, we're going to see how to export two particular pieces of content. You could do a lot more. I actually did a lot more myself. And then an env file, which is going to contain all of the variable information for our MongoDB instance, where we want to export the data to, things like that. This will actually be the last time that I show you the .env file, because I will be populating it with some fairly sensitive information. Definitely don't forget to add this file to your git ignore. If you plan to submit this project to a Git repository, you don't want this sensitive information floating around. The export URLs, of course, is that file that I just showed you with the URL slugs, one particular URL per line in my example. And then the output directory, which doesn't currently exist, it'll be created automatically, is output at the relative path of this project. So it'll appear right next to the package.json, main.js, things like that. So before we start writing some code, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to install our dependencies. So I'm going to say npm install. We're going to say MongoDB, which is our MongoDB Node.js driver. We're going to say that we want to install .env, so that way we can read that .env file. And then we want to add Axios, which is going to be what we're going to be using for making HTTP requests, which is going to be necessary when we start downloading the asset files, which I'm going to talk about shortly. All right, so we have our dependencies. Now what we want to do is we want to start writing our Node.js application. It's going to be several different parts. What we're going to do first is we're going to start with all of the boilerplate code. And I'm going to just fast forward through this so that way you don't have to watch me type. Okay, let me tell you what's going on with this particular boilerplate code. So first of all, we imported the Mongo client, which we're going to be used to interact with MongoDB. We have two interactions with our file system. So I prefer to use promises so that way I can use the await and async functionality. I also need to use this file system, and this is going to be particularly useful when, like I said, downloading asset files. We're going to be downloading image files. We're also going to be reading from files, so we're going to be reading from the export list.txt file, and we're going to be writing some Markdown to files. So there's going to be a lot of file system work, and this was valuable for my particular use case, but yours may be different. So definitely modify this to however makes sense. We're going to load our .env file. We're going to load each of our environment variables, which should be set at this particular point in time. We're going to establish a new Mongo client. In my example, I am connecting to MongoDB Atlas. You might have the Community Edition, Enterprise Edition. It should work either way. But like I said, I'm going to be using MongoDB Atlas. And we have this set up for a database and collection. And we have our asynchronous anonymous function for actually running what we want to accomplish. And we're going to be creating some functions along the way. Before we do that, let's go ahead and focus on actually connecting to MongoDB, because we have our client, but we're not actually connected. So we can do that by saying await and we can say Mongo client dot connect. So this should be connected by the end of this statement, otherwise it'll throw an error, hence our try catch block. Now we want to define the actual database and collection that we plan to use for this particular example. So we're going to say database equals, then we're going to say await Mongo client dot DB, and this is where we can say Mongo database. And likewise, we're going to do something similar for the collection, and that equals await, and that's going to be database dot collection, and this is MongoDB collection. And then finally, by the time this is all said and done, we do want to make sure we close our connection to MongoDB. So we're going to say await, and we're going to say Mongo client dot close. And of course, if it fails for some reason, it's going to just crash and catch this error. All of our code is going to be in here, and we'll populate this shortly. So it is saved. At this point in time, it should work. And we can validate this to make sure there's no errors by just saying node main.js, and it might take a second, and then it'll just end because we're not printing anything, we're not doing anything, we're just establishing the connection, and then we're closing it. All right, so step one. Step one here after the boilerplate is we need to load that export list.txt file, so that way we can read each one of these lines one by one. So let's go ahead and create a function for that. Let's go ahead and call this one async function. And this could be something like load URL file data. And we can include something like the following. We can say let data equals await, because we are using the promise version of the file system. We can say file system.read file. And we can say that we want to use the export URLs, that this is actually the file that we have in our .env file. And we want to say encoding is UTF-8. So potentially we have our data, and what we can do next is we can say let slugs equals data.split. We're going to split by the new line character, because remember, we want one line at a time. And the reason why we're doing this split is because it is easier to work with arrays, and this will create an array of our URL slugs. Now, one thing that I added personally to my project, which was beneficial, is I often don't know if I'm going to have this trailing slash. And if I have a trailing slash in some circumstances and I don't in other circumstances, it kind of messes things up. So I actually added a parameter in mine, and I can add it here as well. I can say remove trailing slash. I'll set that default to false. And then with that, then we can do an operation to kind of clean it up. So if remove trailing slash equals true, what we can do is we can say slugs equals slugs.map. So we're going to go through each array item, so each line. So we have slug, and we can actually do a replace. So slug.replace. And I actually am not good at regex, so I actually downloaded this off on the internet, but this is what we want here. So basically what that's going to do is that's going to just strip out the trailing slash character. Because in my data, I believe my data has the trailing slash, but in case yours doesn't, or in case you want to be able to accommodate that circumstance, it doesn't hurt to add it. Doesn't cause any drama. And then what we want to do is we want to say return slugs. So that's our first step. So we wanted to load that file data. And what we can do is we can actually add it to our main area. So we can say let slugs equals await, and we can say load URL file data, and we can say true. There's trailing slashes in ours, hence the export list. And I can go ahead and save it. It's really not going to do anything as of yet. I mean, if I were to run it again, it will just print nothing again, because we're just connecting to MongoDB and we are loading our data. And now that we have our slugs, well, that's going to be our main driving factor for this application. And I should have showed it earlier, but here's an example of what we're working with in MongoDB. So this is a screenshot. So these are the fields that we have the opportunity to work with in this particular example. And in my case, I have a calculated slug here. Of course, this does not have a trailing slash in the database, even though that my file does, hence why we're removing the trailing slash. But we're going to query based on these slugs. We're going to get our results. So content is going to be the actual Markdown content that we want to save. And then, of course, I'm going to save some other content because it could be valuable when it comes to migrating it to a third-party publishing platform. And I'm talking about platforms like Medium and Dev2, things like that, because that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to move some of our content, not all of our content, to another platform. All right, so with that in mind, let's go ahead and start writing I'm going to use an aggregation pipeline to get this job done. But honestly, you don't need to do a pipeline for this if you don't want to. You can use a regular find operation, but I think it looks a little bit more elegant if I use that pipeline. So let's go ahead and check it out. So we're going to say let cursor equals collection.aggregate. We're going to provide it an array, so an array of stages. If you're not familiar with an aggregation pipeline in MongoDB, you're working with one stage at a time, and as your data flows through it, by the end of the pipeline, you're going to get some kind of manipulated result based on each of the stages that you've added. So the first stage that we want to add is a match. We want to match for certain pieces of content. And we're going to be matching on the calculated slug field. And because we're working with an array, MongoDB does have an operator that is available to us that makes life a lot easier for us. We're going to use the in operator. And when we use the in operator, we can just pass that array right in there. And what's going to happen is it's going to match for any document in MongoDB, in our MongoDB collection, that matches one of the items in our slugs array. It's gonna find all the results that match our array. Now let's go ahead and look at the next stage. So the next stage, we kind of want to clean it up because it's probably too much data, or the data is in the wrong format. Your usage may vary, but in my case, I needed to do some minor modifications. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another object here. I'm going to say this is going to be my projection stage, which is usually for limiting fields or changing fields slightly. You can do some powerful stuff in there too. But what I want is I want a title. So I already have a name field. So I just want to rename that name field to title. It makes more sense to me. So I'm going to use $name. And by using the $, it's saying that I want to use one of the actual fields in the previous step, previous field being name. If I had removed the $, title would just equal name as is, with not the actual name of the content. So let's go ahead and add some more. We're going to say description. I like to add quotes. It's not necessary though. Description 1 means just include description as is. Slug, what I want to do is I want to use that as the calculated slug because it just looks nicer in my opinion. Authors, we can leave it as is. Tags, leave it as is. And content being our Markdown content, we can also leave that as is. So these are the fields that we want to work with, even though that there are more. And in our circumstance, 2 of those fields we're just doing a basic rename. So nothing particularly fancy. So after this aggregation pipeline call, we want to either loop through the cursor that we've just obtained, or in my case, since I only have 2 results, I'm just going to convert it to an array directly. So I'm going to say let matched content equals await cursor dot to array. If you had a lot of results, you might consider using a cursor. It's more efficient for working with massive amounts of data because when you use the to array, you're essentially getting all of the results all at once, which if you're not sure what your result set size is, it could be slow. It could cause a lot of implications on your server resources. You never know. So just do it with caution. All right, now that we have the array, we're really still not printing anything out, but at least we now have potential results back. And if I wanted to, I can say console.log. I'm just going to say matched content. We'll see what it prints out here. So it didn't take that much time at all. It gave us a lot of stuff back, but that's because most of it was Markdown content. Remember, these are actual blog posts, so they are quite long. So let's keep going down the line to our next step. So the next thing that we want to do, we have all of the data that we want from MongoDB. We want to store it to our local file system because that's going to be the easiest way for us to transfer it somewhere else in this particular example. So let's go ahead and create a function that'll actually do the writing to the file system. So I'm going to say function. I'm going to say save markdown to file. I'm going to provide it a slug because the slug is going to be important for our naming. So that way it's not just all mashed into one single directory. And then we want to provide it the markdown, the actual markdown content, which is a string in this example. All right, so first of all, we want to split up the slug into parts. So we're going to say let parts equals slug.split. And what we're going to do is we're going to filter out all of the empty array elements because we're potentially going to end up with spaces or blank space in there. So we're going to say part, and we're going to say part not equal to empty string. So we have our slug, each slug that we want to pass broken up. Now, the reason why we're doing that is because for naming purposes, we don't want to include the slashes. We literally want, and I'll show you in this file, we literally just want this. That's how we're going to name each of the files that we save. We just want this part. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to define the actual file name that we want to use. So we're going to say let entry name equals parts. And I want the very end, so the very last part. So I can just say parts.length -1 in that array because it is an array. And next, we can actually do the writing using the file system library. So what we can say is we can say return, we can say file system dot make directory because we really aren't sure if that directory exists yet. We want to provide the output directory, which was defined in our .env file. We want to make use of the entry name, which we just defined. So we have the path right now, but not all of it. We want to create more because what we're going to do is we're going to do a recursive create on this make directory. We also want to define assets. So it might look something like this. So we might have output / blog name here, the slug, and then assets. That's what we want. So the actual blog name, the idea is that we're going to store the markdown inside of this directory, and we're going to store all of the images and whatnot in the assets directory. And we're just creating it all at once using this make directory command. And we can pass in this parameter. We can say recursive true, so that way it just creates everything along that line. We're going to chain this promise. We're just going to say then, and after the directory has been created, we're going to say file system dot write file, and we're going to do a lot of that again. So we're just going to copy this. I'm going to clean it up, but we're going to paste it in there. We're going to remove the assets part, so we have the directory, but we also want the file name. So the file name is also entry name. You could just call it blog.md if you want it to, and we're going to provide a markdown extension. And for what we want to write, so that's the file name, what we want to write is going to be that markdown text. And just like that, we're good at saving our markdown. One more thing that we can do here, and I know that we could be efficient in our code writing, but we can just copy this for the sake of this example, paste it, and in this one, what I can do is I can say save metadata to file. So in this case, I'll pass in a data object. And the point here is I want to keep track of the information like the author name or the tags in case I want to use them in the future, but I don't want to include it in the markdown file itself. So we're gonna make slight changes here. We're gonna keep the first part of this. We're gonna keep the make directory because if that directory already exists, it's just gonna skip over it. It's not gonna cause any kind of problems. But what we want to write is we want to write instead of the file name .md, we're just gonna say meta.json. And we're going to provide the data. So it's going to sit side by side together. And I can save that. So let's go ahead and add these two functions to our actual main anonymous function here. I don't need to print this out anymore. It's just going to be wasteful. So instead, what I want to do is I want to loop through each of the results. So in this case, there should be only 2 results. But I'm going to say for constant match. So for every match of matched content, we're going to do something. And in this example so far, we're going to say await. We're going to say save markdown to file. We're going to say match.slug because remember our result set of matched content, we have a slug in there. So we're going to say match.slug and we're going to say match.content. So that's going to save the markdown. The next thing we want to do is we want to save the meta information, but we don't want to save the markdown content with the meta information. So I can easily just say delete and I can say match.content. It's not deleting it from the database, just to be clear. It's just deleting it from the local object. So match will no longer contain content for this iteration. I can do await save metadata to file. I can say match.slug and I can say json.stringify and I can say match and I can say undefined. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I want it formatted in that export file for the metadata. Because if I don't do that, it's just going to mash it into basically a 1-line unformatted JSON string, which is fine. It's definitely optimized that version, but we want something readable for us. So we've saved 2 files here. And if I save this and I run this, it should work out fine. So it ran, it completed, it created an output directory. If I open it, I have my 2 directories. I have assets, which for now, they're going to be blank. I have the meta information, which includes all my tags, description, authors, things like that. And then I have the actual markdown for transfer as well. So far, so good. That's kind of half the battle right now. So in my example, the actual assets, the images, are not stored in MongoDB. And in most circumstances, you probably don't want to store those in MongoDB. You probably want to use S3 or something else. But I don't want to publish this content elsewhere and link back to the old hosted asset files because I don't know if they're going to exist in the future. So instead, it makes sense to download those asset files and just upload them fresh with this content wherever it might exist in the future. So we're going to create some functions. It's not a whole lot of work, but it's very valuable here. So first, we're going to say function. We're going to say extract asset URLs because we don't know what our assets are right now. We need to dig through our Markdown content and pull out every image URL that exists in that content. And we want to store that as an array because then we're going to actually go through that array and download each of those assets. So it's going to be two-step. So first we have text, which is just our Markdown text. And let's start things off. So I actually have a regular expression. And like I said, I'm not the best with regular expressions, so I actually found this one online. This will basically pull out each of these particular file types. And that's going to be valuable when it comes to searching through our Markdown. So we have that there. We can say let asset URLs equals text match. We're going to say asset URL regex because that's what we have for our match condition. And if nothing, we're just going to provide, or if it's fresh, it's just going to be an empty array. Now, there's a little bit more to it though. So in my example, and this may not happen in your example, in my example, I have some strange URLs that are images. So for example, I might have something like google.com and then some kind of URL parameter equals HTTP asset file here. So this isn't particularly useful. I can't download anything from here. What I want is what comes after the URL part. So I have to do an extra step in my scenario. And you might, in yours, I have no idea, or maybe these two lines, 78 and 79, are enough for you. Just keep it into consideration that you may need to actually validate that your URL is valid. So what you can do to do that is you can say something like asset URLs, and I can say equals asset URLs dot map, because I'm going to go through each of those URLs. I'm going to say asset, and we're going to do some checks. So my checks, I'm going to use the URL object that's available in JavaScript. So I'm going to say let URL object equals new URL, and I'm going to pass it that asset. So I have a URL object now. I'm going to say let URL params equals new URL search params. So that's going to be the query condition that happens after the main URL. So I'm going to say URL object dot search. And here's where we're actually going to do our check in my scenario. So I'm going to say if URL params dot has URL, because in my case it did. It was like something like google.com/ or question mark URL, and that's what I'm looking for. So if it has that, then I know I probably want what comes after. So I'm going to say asset equals URL params dot get URL. So I'm just going to get whatever is set in that value. And I'm going to return the asset. So if it doesn't have this URL field, well, it's just going to return this particular asset right there. So the original. If it does have that URL parameter, it's going to set that as the new asset and return it anyways. And then finally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say return asset URLs. So by the end of this, we should have an array of actual images or image URLs. And the next thing that we want to do is we want to actually download those URLs. It's not good enough just to know what they are. We actually want the content that exists at those. And this is where Axios comes in my example. You don't have to use Axios. You can get by with some fetches or other libraries, but I found this one the easiest approach for me. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to say function. I'm going to say download asset. I'm going to provide it the asset URL, one single URL, and the slug, because the slug is going to be important for our path information. So we're going to say let URL parts equal asset URL dot split. Of course, we're splitting it up once again. I'm going to say let slug parts equals slug dot split. I'm going to say filter again, and I'm going to just make sure that I'm not ending up with empty array items. So I'm going to say part not equal to empty string. Now we can define the file name and the file path. So I'm going to say let file name equals URL parts. I'm going to say URL parts dot length minus 1. All of it's pretty familiar. There's better ways to do all of this more efficiently code-wise, but I'm not trying to make the most efficient, most perfect piece of code here. I just want something that works and that's easy to read. So I have the file name. Now what I want is the file path. So I'm going to say file path equals the output directory, which we once again define in the .env file. We want the slug parts, and I'm going to say slug parts.length minus 1. So this is the path. And I'm going to say assets. So that's where we plan to save things. So that's why we did the URL parts and the slug parts separately. Now let's make our Axios call. So this is going to be actually making the request and taking the stream of data and storing it to a file. So we're going to say return Axios. We're going to provide the method, which in this case is going to be a GET request. We're going to provide the URL, which is going to be the asset URL. And for this, we want the response type defined because we don't want to work with JSON data. This is actually binary data that we're working with because they're files. So response type is going to be stream. So that's our request. When it comes time to actually taking care of business, we can say then, we can say response. And this is now we need to actually store the response as something. So in this case, I can say we want to work with promises because we don't know how large these files are going to be. It's not going to be a quick thing in a lot of circumstances. We're going to say new promise, and we just need to know when the file download has completed. So we're going to say resolve, reject. We're going to work with the response data, and we're going to say pipe. So we're going to say create write stream, and we're going to say file path plus file name. So that's where we're planning to write the file. If there's an error, so we're going to say on error, we're going to reject the promise. And when the promise is done, so when all of the bits and pieces have been written to that file, we're going to say once close. So the stream is closed. And when the stream is closed, that's where we resolve the promise. So we're going to say resolve, and we're going to just say the file path and file name again. And that should be good. But what we want to do is there are circumstances for errors in this example. So maybe there's a 401 error because the file, you don't have permission to download it. Maybe it's a 404, it doesn't exist. We don't want the whole application to crash in this circumstance. So what we're going to do is we're going to catch, and we're going to say error. And if there's an error, we're going to say we're only going to look for certain codes that are going to really affect us. So we're going to say error.response. So if the error.response exists, then we're going to look at error.response.status. And we basically want to make sure that the status is between 400 and between 500. So error.response.status is less than or equal to 500. If the error code is anywhere between those, that means that we couldn't get access to that file for some reason. And instead of just crashing everything, we probably just want to warn the user that, hey, there was an issue. Maybe go back and look for potential problems. So we're going to say console.warn. We're going to say maybe skipping asset. And we can say something along the lines of, I don't know, error.response.status. And maybe we say :asset URL. So we're providing the status code and we're providing the URL that failed. You can make yours a little more extravagant if you want, but it should be good enough for us. All right, so we have our two functions for getting the URLs and downloading the assets. So if we go back to our main function here, probably before we start saving the meta information because we still want to work with the content. So what we can do is we can say something like let asset URLs equals extract asset URL. We're going to say match.content because we're providing the markdown. So in this case, in theory, we should end up with an array of URLs by the end of it, assuming that there are actually images in this particular markdown. And then if there are, the next thing we want to do is we want to start downloading everything. But we don't want problems. We don't want to block anything really. We want to make sure everything downloads. We have no idea what these file sizes are. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to do a promise.all. And I want to look through every single asset in this asset URL and let them happen hopefully in parallel. So what we can say is await. We can say promise.all. We can say asset URLs.map. And we're going to say asset, download asset. We're going to provide the asset. We're going to provide the slug information. And we're just going to provide a trailing slash here because I forgot to add it. And that should be good. So it's going to return a promise for each one of the assets. and we're just going to download them all and use the await here. So if I run this, actually let me remove the output directory, so that way we can start fresh. If I run this, hopefully everything works out. So I'm going to run it. It might take a couple seconds. So it ran. It didn't look like there was any errors. Hopefully it worked. So I look at the output. I look at one of these assets that we downloaded. So we click on the assets directory. Undefined here. So that's interesting. So looking at the code, it looks like I have a typo here. I'm surprised it didn't throw any errors. I probably have poor error checking in here, but let's go ahead and change this to length. And so there was a problem with the file name, obviously. So let's go ahead and start from scratch here. I'm going to run it again, and hopefully it works out. So no errors again. So let's go ahead and go look at the output. And this time around, we do actually have downloads. So if I click on, I don't know if they're going to load. Loaded, perfect. So it actually downloaded all the assets there in the original file names. And if I look at the other example, it looks like we're probably good there too. Yeah, Trader Joe's. So it looks like it downloaded all of our assets. Of course, it downloaded our meta information and the actual Markdown content itself. So it did everything as expected. Now, I'm sure there's ways to optimize this, but for the sake of my needs, this worked out well. Because like I said, the whole goal here for me on a personal level was I needed to republish some content outside of the MongoDB blog. But of course, I needed to download that content, which was inside of the MongoDB database. I needed to save it to the file system. I needed to get all the assets so that way it's ready to go and get republished. And this worked out well for me. So if you've got a similar example where you need to maybe do an aggregation pipeline with MongoDB, maybe you need to download some files. I know that it wasn't really heavy on MongoDB. The MongoDB part was just this simple aggregation pipeline, but it's a practical example on where you might want to use MongoDB in the wild. Maybe it's not for actual API or something. So it's definitely an option. If you enjoyed this video, please leave it a thumbs up on YouTube and then drop a comment and let me know if you found it valuable. Maybe there's things that you would have liked to see differently, or maybe your own experience with similar topics. I'd love to hear them. Until next time, have a great rest of your day.